Hey everyone, I'm Belle Reid, and welcome back to another episode of That Sounds Weird. Today, we're going to be taking a look at some weird tricks that you can do with Wavefolders. Until recently, wavefolders have not been a common part of synthesizers. So even if you've been using synthesizers for decades, it's still possible that you may not have encountered a wavefolder. So with that in mind, let's start with a basic definition of what wavefolding is and where it came from. A wavefolder is a basic synthesizer building block that is typically used to increase the harmonic complexity of harmonically simple waveforms, like sine waves and triangle waves. Wavefolders usually have a continuously variable control for determining how much harmonic complexity is added, allowing you to sweep through a wide spectrum of different timbres. Typically, in analog synthesizers, you manage harmonic complexity by applying filtering to harmonically complex waveforms. For instance, you might mix together a couple of oscillators' sawtooth waves and then pass them through a filter. The saw waves produce a bright, buzzy sound by themselves, and the filtering process allows you to remove harmonics and soften the contours of the wave shape. You can conceptualize wavefolders as working sort of opposite to this. Instead of starting with harmonically rich waveforms and removing overtones, you instead start with simple waveforms and you add overtones. In other words, instead of starting bright and making sounds darker, we start with dull sounds and make them brighter. So how exactly does that work? You can think of a wavefolder as being a complex distortion process. We can think of distortion as being a process that alters the amplitude of a signal. With a more conventional distortion, you'll probably have a gain control, which controls the amount of distortion applied to the signal that passes through it, adjusting the amplitude of the incoming signal until it starts to approach an upper and lower amplitude limit imposed by the circuit itself. Once your incoming signal's amplitude reaches this threshold, it stays at the threshold voltage until the amplitude passes back to the other side of the threshold. So here on this oscilloscope, I have two signals running into it. One of them, the yellow one, is just our direct sine wave from this oscillator. And the purple one is what's coming from this distortion module. I'm going to turn up the gain here, and we'll see the amplitude of that signal increasing until it hits the upper and lower threshold. And there, you can see that once it hits that threshold, it stays at those levels until the amplitude passes back to the other side of the threshold. This effect is commonly referred to as clipping, and visually it's easy to understand why, because beyond the threshold imposed by the circuit, the highest and lowest parts of your waveform are clipped. Wavefolders are similar to this, but different. Like a more typical distortion, wavefolders do have a gain control that allows you to alter the amplitude of the signal that passes through them. The difference, though, is what happens when the incoming voltage goes beyond the threshold. So here I have a sine wave running into this wavefolder, and I'm going to gradually increase the gain. And you'll see that as the sine wave passes the upper and lower thresholds, the signal folds back in the other direction, rather than simply clipping at the threshold. This introduces a peculiar set of harmonics, and the more you push it, the more the spectrum of the sound evolves. control on wavefolders can have a lot of different names. It's common to refer to this parameter as timbre or fold amount. Sometimes wavefolders also have a bias parameter, which may be also referred to as symmetry. This parameter usually works by adding a DC offset to the incoming sound. By offsetting the incoming waveform up or down, you can cause the effect of the wavefolder to be more asymmetrical, altering the upper and lower portion of the waveform differently from one another and resulting in different harmonic emphasis. Suddenly, this provides your incoming waveform with access to a two-dimensional timbre space. And by adjusting these two controls relative to one another, you can find an enormous number of distinct timbres. So I said before that wavefolders aren't that common in analog synthesizers, or at least they weren't until recently. The first commercially developed wavefolders appear in Donald Buchla's instruments, namely in the later versions of the Music Easel, the 502, and the late 1970s 259 programmable complex waveform generator, which has become a sort of de facto model that many modern instrument designers refer to for inspiration. Similarly, wavefolders appear in some of Serge Trepnin's 1970s modular systems as well, which drew inspiration directly from Buchla's work. Now, to label Buchla and Serge's work as commercial is maybe a bit misleading. Their instruments were made to order by hand in very low quantities, and it wasn't until Eurorack modular synthesizers gained popularity in the early 2000s that wavefolders started appearing more frequently. And today, they're a relatively common tool and appear in both modular synths and self-contained instruments. All right, so now that we have a handle on what wavefolders are, how they work, and where they came from, here are some of my favorite tricks for using wavefolders to do some super weird. Really quick, before we move forward, I want to take a sec to tell you about my online class, Learning Sound and Synthesis. Learning Sound and Synthesis is a super comprehensive and step-by-step program that teaches you everything you need to make music with modular synthesizers, to design your own sounds from scratch, and to turn your synth sounds and patches into complete compositions and performances. Whether you want to make ambient soundscapes, melodic generative music, synth pop, techno, noisy, chaotic sci-fi sounds, or anything in between. When you join Learning Sound and Synthesis, you'll also get access to an incredibly supportive community of people who, just like you, are super passionate about electronic music and modular synths. And you'll also be able to get personalized support and feedback on your music. I typically offer Learning Sound and Synthesis 1 to 2 times per year. You can learn more and join the waitlist for the next round by going to soundandsynthesis.com/waitlist. Learning synth and synthesis. Okay, so in the last That Sounds Weird video, we talked about oscillator cross-modulation, where you can use two oscillators to modulate one another, resulting in chaotic, unpredictable sounds. Here, I want to focus on a related technique, which is oscillator self-modulation. You can use an oscillator to modulate its own frequency with any wave shape. So here I'm running the sine wave output from this oscillator back into its own frequency modulation input. As you increase the FM amount, you'll hear a change in pitch. The wave shape will probably distort or skew a little bit, and as a result, the timbre will change. The thing is, if the oscillator shape is fairly simple, then the resulting sound will tend to be pretty stable. The more more complex the wave shape used for modulation, though, the more the sound will destabilize. So, for instance, running a sine wave through a wavefolder and then using the wavefolder's output to frequency modulate that same sine wave can get pretty gnarly pretty fast. So for this example, we're going to listen to the output of the sine wave directly rather than the output from the wavefolder. And we're just using the wavefolder to distort the sine wave that's being used to FM this oscillator. And with this setup, changing the frequency of the oscillator, the FM depth, the wavefolder amount, the bias amount, all are going to have a really big impact on the resulting sound. This sounds different on different instruments, depending on how the oscillators and wavefolders you're using are parameterized. You can also use the wavefolder's output to modulate different aspects of the wave shaping process rather than FMing the oscillator. And of course, you can also combine these things together. So let's add frequency modulation back in as well. We could also extend this idea back into the world of cross modulation. So in this example here, I'm doing cross modulation between two oscillators, but one of the oscillators in the FM feedback loop has a wavefolder. So let's listen to the way that changing the wavefolder parameters changes the behavior of the cross modulated sound. All right, if all of that wasn't weird enough for you, let's take things up a notch. Many wavefolders can actually be used as a sound generator all on their own. Now, this does require that the wavefolder have some kind of signal input. So this may not work with wavefolders that are hardwired to an oscillator's output. But the idea is very simple. If you connect the output of a wavefolder to its own signal input, with the right combinations of settings, you can get it to self-oscillate. One thing to note here is that this technique can be a little bit finicky. Some wavefolders will self-oscillate more readily than others, and some will give a broader spectrum of results than others. I recommend taking time to slowly adjust parameters on the wavefolder to see what you can find, because sometimes even small tweaks can yield really big differences. In the world of hardware, one of the best wavefolders I've ever used for this purpose is the second Serge wave multiplier. The Serge wave multipliers module is actually 3 distinct circuits. The top is a linear VCA, the bottom is a sort of variable rectifier, and the middle is a really awesome wavefolder. So here I simply have the output of the wavefolder patched back into its own input, and let's see what it sounds like. This technique is really common in Thomas Ankersmith's music, so I highly recommend that you go check it out because it's really, really cool. You can also combine this with other types of wave shaping to create super interesting sounds. Because this is a digital wavefolder with a sample rate and signal vector size applied to it, the results sound pretty different from an analog wavefolder. But nonetheless, this behavior is very similar. This module is one of my favorites for creating glitchy, kind of trashy sounding percussive sounds. Another cool thing you can do is to use a sample and hold in the feedback path. If you clock the sample and hold at pretty high frequencies, you'll still be able to get audio feedback, and its character will change a lot depending on both the wavefolder settings and the rate of the sample and hold. I find these techniques interesting and exciting for similar reasons as to why I find oscillator cross-modulation so interesting. I think that part of it is that it's a technique that doesn't really come along with any rules or any baggage related to traditional technique. And so it feels easy to just let go and let exploration and listening guide your musical process, and to intuitively find ways to fit it into your music. On a technical level, it's also a really great way of generating a sense of surprise, because once you have all of these chaotic, self-influencing patches up and running, it's actually extremely difficult to know exactly what will happen when you interact with things. Turning a knob one way might cause things to become really thin and crackly, or really loud and sputtery, or maybe even completely silent. And for me, it's always really fun and interesting to be able to couple this sense of surprise with a very simple and intuitive physical action. I use these wavefolder techniques in my music all of the time, sometimes to create soft, crackly textures that act more as an atmospheric layer, and other times to create percussive, glitchy sounds that I chop up and use as sample material. And sometimes I just like to use it as part of an improvisational context to help my instrument feel a little bit more alive and a little bit more collaborative. I have packaged up all of the raw sound material from the creation of this video into an audio download that is available over on my Patreon community. So if you're interested in joining a wonderful community of folks who are passionate about things like experimental sound and modular synthesis, or if you're interested in things like audio downloads and behind the scenes content, then you can go to patreon.com/SarahBelleReid to learn more and possibly join. As a patron, you are able to download these audio samples, and you are welcome to use them in your own music in any way that you'd like. You can chop them up and use them as samples, turn them into something new, whatever you feel inspired by, they are yours to use. All right, that's it for today. As always, thank you so much for watching and for listening, and I'll see you next time. Forgot for a second what I was doing. Did I say that right? I'm going to do it again just in case I said something like harmonic. One more time. That allows you to amplify, to create really soft, crackly. That's a new word. I was like, do I have time for coffee? Yes.